Here's a big sounding claim. Manchester supergroup New Order are the second most influential band ever to come out of the northwest of England. Alright, you might not have achieved the sales of your Simply Reds or the Immortal Smiths, but as any intelligent, hip, mature and critically aware person will tell you, New Order are certainly the most majestic pop group of the modern era. They created the soundtrack for the post-punk generation. For a quarter of a century, this group of self-taught musicians and technicians have surfed the spirit of their age, unself-consciously inventing and reinventing themselves. In so doing, their music has developed and fused into a unique hybrid of rock, dance and electronica. And they did it first. And always on their own terms. Here are some other punters who think New Order are just the knees of one of them there bees. Journalist and broadcaster Paul Morley.
You didn't dare say it really because it was Manchester and there were guys, blokes you knew and had a pint with at awful grungy pubs, but you thought, hang on, these are better than the Door.
New York musician Moby.
You know, there are really, throughout the history of music, only 3 or 4 seminal groups who I've been really influenced by. The music that I make would sound a lot different if New Order had never existed.
Factory Records boss Tony Wilson.
Someone had to make punk express more complex emotions.
Incidentally, I'm Mark Radcliffe, should you be interested, and you're listening to the first part of TX New Order. Permit me to take you back in time. Before the subjects of our story became New Order, they were known as Joy Division. Before that, they were Warsaw. And for about 10 minutes before that, they were called the Stiff Kittens. All of the above began with Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook, 2 rapscallions from Salford, technically not in Manchester. Friends from school, the pair shared an obsession for music. On June the 4th, 1976, Bernard and Hookie attended a Sex Pistols gig at Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall. This gig galvanised a whole generation of northwestern punks-to-be. Among the other eager punters at this event, allegedly, were its organisers Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto of punk band Buzzcocks, Morrissey, who later formed the Smiths, ginger punk mix Simply Red Hucknall, and a scattering and smattering of local faces such as producer Martin Hannett and Granada TV reporter Tony Wilson. The gig was a punk rock Sermon on the Mount. Journalist Paul Morley shared the epiphany.
But there was about 42 people. They were all loners, pretty much all boys, coming out of their bedrooms. You know, the Morrisseys of the world is a classic sort of metaphor for that. And we all sort of staggered into this strange little place to see a group that even then we could sense were going to be more exciting than the Rolling Stones and the Beatles put together.
I used to read the music papers because I was so bored in work, and I read about the Sex Pistols.
Peter Hook.
I was reading about them fighting at all the gigs, and I thought, that sounds interesting. And then I came back to Manchester, and there was a little tiny advert in the evening news for the Sex Pistols, 50p. 50p. Me, Bernard and Terry, our other mate from school, went to see him.
Mythically, you get the feeling they were all there. I think Ian Curtis was definitely there, and I think got the feeling Barney and Hookie were there.
And it was then we watched him and thought, bloody hell, we could do this.
It looked exciting and new
as
well,
it was
you
like,
know,
wow.
fresh. It looked fresh.
You just sort of found what you were looking for, really.
It was that kind of music that you responded to the most, suddenly being made by English people in a really English setting.
Here's Bernard Sumner.
For some reason, they sort of connected with it and thought, I want to do that.
God knows why, considering that we were interested in music from a listening point of view, but we never considered ever having a musical career. I'd never played an instrument, and after seeing the Sex Pistols, I suddenly decided to become a musician. I had no musical ability, apart from playing the recorder badly.
Hooky immediately discarded his recorder in favour of the more macho bass guitar. Inspired by the DIY message of punk, he began to practice with Bernard. Interestingly, their first efforts betrayed an instinct for technical innovation, which was later to become one of their trademarks. Bernard Sumner, New Order's singer and guitarist.
I had a guitar that my mother had bought me when I was 16, and he bought a bass. And we used to go in my grandmother's front parlour, and she had a 1940s gramophone. So I pulled the needle out, soldered a jack socket on the stylus arm, plugged my guitar into the needle of this gramophone.
The pair headhunted a singer called Ian Curtis. Hooky explains.
Ian was in the band, but then Ian's band split up. And we said, right, we've got a band, three of us, we need a singer, you're our singer, let's advertise for a drummer.
They found their drummer through an ad placed in the window of a local newsagent's. Stephen Morris, the Macclesfield metronome, got the gig. Stephen's the voice you'll hear after Hooky's. Remember it, because it is indeed a rare privilege to hear him speak in an interview.
Just turned up one day, didn't you, at the Abraham Moss Centre in Manchester.
Strange ways.
Yeah, in Cheetham Hill, and we just started
strange
playing.
ways.
Steve had a unique style, whereas all the other drummers that we had, you never listened to them and thought, that's great. Whereas what Steve played, you thought, that's great.
Journalist and broadcaster Paul Morley.
Hooky was making up how to play the bass and found an incredibly new way of doing it. Barney stumbled into being a Macclesfield Lou Reed. Stephen was an extraordinary drummer, which was a very necessary thing in a way, because if you pinned down the rhythm, the guitars and bass could skitter all over the shop. So the fact that Stephen at the centre of it was an absolutely monstrously brilliant, nerdy pulse beat. And then Ian was livid. You could see in his eyes he would be a foot away from you. He was gone somewhere.
The group called themselves Warsaw. Early songs, such as At a Later Date, betrayed the punk influence of the Pistols, but their first gigs were more memorable for their energy than their ability. Still, Warsaw drew the attention of Rob Gretton, a self-effacing former insurance exec turned local DJ. Gretton had links with Wythenshawe punk outfits Slaughter and the Dogs. He was hard, but humble. His friend, photographer Kevin Cummins, explains.
He used to call himself Rob the Boar. No one knew his surname at the time. He did a fanzine called Manchester Rains, Slaughter and the Dogs fanzine. Rob decided he was going to get involved with the band because it was still quite chaotic when they were Warsaw. We all didn't really like them, we thought they were quite arrogant. But Rob saw something in them and wanted to get involved.
Rob Gretton speaking in 1987.
Warsaw didn't go on till about gone 2 in the morning. It was on like 20 or 30 people left. And I just thought they were the best band I'd ever seen.
When they changed the name and when they became Joy Division and worked on Unknown Pleasures and played The Factory in July that year, it was absolutely incredible. It was as though they were reborn. They were suddenly the greatest band in the world.
Rob Gretton saw us play and asked to become our manager, which is quite a funny story because Bernard never told the rest of us, and this guy with glasses and a grey patch in his head walked into practice one day while we were practicing, and everyone was looking at him and he sat down and he's like, oh, well, something I've not told you. This is our manager. Anyway, that was Rob Gretton.
I got to tell him, he came up to me in a phone box and saw you play last night.
That night I couldn't sleep very well because I was thinking about it all the time. And I was going on to my girlfriend about it in the morning. And I went into town the next day to do some shopping or something. I went to the phone boxes on Spring Gardens and Barney was in the next phone booth and I tapped him on the shoulder and said, have you got a manager? And he said, no.
He became our manager just in the same way that we became musicians. No experience.
He was actually, when I saw him in the phone box, he was on his way for a job to be a toilet cleaner.
Very lucky for him, that, wasn't it?
So
that meeting, and lucky for us, as it turned out.
So it might have been that he didn't think we were really talented, but he just really didn't fancy being a toilet cleaner.
Probably, yeah, it could have been.
Hi, look who's here. It's Anthony H. Wilson, TV personality, promoter, music exec and Cambridge-educated man about Manchester. By the way, the loud squeak that you can hear in the Tony Wilson sections of this documentary, the ones that sound like rubber soles in a sports hall, are caused by a broken smoke alarm in Tony's luxurious Manchester bachelor apartment. So, if you're listening, Tony's builder, get it fixed, will you?
Remember, Joy Division was 5 people, because Joy Division, from the very beginning, when Rob became the manager, which was about the time I met them, Rob was the 5th member of the group, and it worked like that for a very long time, until the late 80s. And I think Rob is one of the great rock and roll managers of all time.
Warsaw had by now become Joy Division. Ian Curtis took the new name from the section of a Nazi concentration camp where Jewish women were forced into prostitution. The best of the band's early efforts were recorded on the Ideal for Living EP.
It's basically the Ideal for Living EP with the first 4 songs that we thought, these are different to the rest of it.
Ideal for Living attracted critical acclaim and created a buzz about the band. But not everyone was totally won over by its droning, spiky Sturm und Drang. Gillian Gilbert was the girlfriend of drummer Stephen Morris, and later a member of New Order herself.
Well, it was my sister who brought it up to Stephen while we were at the practice room. And because we'd sort of heard them through the walls of the practice room, we used to think, oh, these are really good, you know. So they always want to buy the EP, and we said, oh, yeah. So we got it, and we took it home, and we played it on the record player, and we thought, oh, my God, it's awful.
Here's that man again.
I first saw Joy Division New Order at the Electric Circus in Manchester, the great punk club. It was an utterly painful cacophony of sound. However, there was something very quirky and very specific and very intriguing about the lead singer.
Here's Hooky.
We'd always seen Tony Wilson around Manchester. He was like the figurehead of punk.
I kept my eye on them to a degree as a local television journalist, putting bands on television, and the next time I had any contact with them was at the Stiff Chiswick Test at Rafters, the famous gig in 1978, when a man in a grey, dirty raincoat sat next to me.
We were all so wound up. I think we played like demons, and Ian was berserk. He was like Iggy Pop. He smashed a bottle on his legs, ripped a table off, threw it at the audience.
And he says, "You haven't put my band on television."
Every time he saw Tony, "Should have put on your show, you bastard, we're great, we're all that." You know, he used to give him loads of grief.
I didn't want to say that I know who you are, it was Mr. Curtis. I know about your band. I know you have just changed the name of your band to Joy Division, and actually you are the next band I'm going to put on. And in fact, a few months later, even as I was about to start working with them as a record company, I actually did put them on, and they performed Shadow Play brilliantly on Granada Reports, the local news programme.
Tony was impressed by the sheer power of it, I suppose, the songs and the aggression and everything. And Rob approached him about us going on Factory, and the rest is history, I suppose.
Factory Records was formed by Tony Wilson, actor Alan Erasmus, and producer Martin Hannett. The label's idealistic attitude was exemplified by the brief but categorical contract Wilson offered to Joy Division. Quote, "The musicians own everything. The company owns nothing. All our bands have the freedom to fuck off." Look, don't blame me. I'm just quoting from a legal document, OK? Blame this guy for the swearing. He wrote it.
We felt that music was something sacred and wonderful, and as something sacred, it should not be owned by businessmen. It should not be marketed as product. Those were all our perceptions at the time, and they were fed into the way we did it. And I still like that, even though it bankrupted us in the end. Music wasn't a product. It should not be promoted or marketed. It is just what it is, and that the company that does it shouldn't own it. We should just be a conduit for great art to get to the people.
An early Factory recruit was designer Peter Saville. His visual style complemented the label's independent stance on artistic freedom.
What I was aiming for was a style of modernist graphic design. The style of youth packaging then was punk, and I saw the sort of design that I thought would come after the sort of new wave look, and it was very disciplined and it was very strict, and working for Factory gave me the opportunity to do it in a very pure form.
In May 1979, Joy Division released their first full album, Unknown Pleasures. It was recorded by the band and producer Martin Hannett in less time than it took Savile to create its enigmatic black textured sleeve. But both the sleeve and the album were brilliant. Bernard Sumner.
Unknown Pleasures were recorded at weekends because we all had day jobs.
8 days, wasn't it? It took 8 days, start to finish.
Here's some archive of Martin Hannett explaining what attracted him to the band.
It was the feel of the bass and drums. They were a dance band with kinetic appeal from Ian, but the rest, they were just one huge rhythm machine. Barney was playing bottom 2 strings on his guitar most of the time, definitely only 2 strings at once anyway, and they just meshed into a big machine that made very danceable sounds.
The producer might have been initially attracted by Joy Division's powerful live sound, but the band felt that he'd misrepresented it on Unknown Pleasures. Here's Bernard and Hooky.
We weren't there at the mix, so when we heard the finished thing, we got
It wasn't anywhere near as powerful and as aggressive as we felt we were.
We felt like that Martin put his imprint on the stuff, which was really interesting, like all the quirky noises and stuff in it.
To my mind, Martin gave it a depth that you wouldn't even consider because, again, it was down to an experience a little.
No, I just think Martin wanted to do a studio bass recording, whereas we just wanted to sound like we did live.
Whatever the band's reservations, Unknown Pleasures was ecstatically received. Joy Division continued to work with Hannett on their next album, Closer, but the relationship was troublesome. Neither Hannett nor singer Ian Curtis were stable personalities. Hannett was addicted to drugs, and Curtis's own epilepsy was a source of his growing depression. But Hannett and the band continued to fashion more remarkable music, such as the single Atmosphere, a song which, for many, represents the true sublime moment of the Joy Division sound. This track, amongst others, helped propel the band to the brink of global recognition, and a tour of America beckoned. Then, on the 18th of May 1980, the day before Joy Division were to fly to New York, Ian Curtis's emotional fragility finally shattered. He hanged himself in his home in Macclesfield. Rob Gretton.
We were going to America the Monday, and he seemed in good spirits. We'd all bought new clothes, and he seemed to be looking forward to going to America.
Paul Morley was among the first to hear of Curtis's death.
The editor of the New Musical Express told me one day, he rang me up at home. He said, I think Ian Curtis has died, and I'd immediately rang Tony Wilson. It was personally kind of interesting for me, because my father had killed himself a couple of years before. Any suicide in the world, if you've had a suicide in the family, has a resonance. The fact that it was someone I knew and was the lead singer in my favourite band. And I rang Wilson, and he was obviously in a state of shock and also in a state of planning out of it, because he had that like McLaren-esque sort of zeal to his sort of life.
Kevin Cummins remembers how the event was portrayed in some sections of the press.
NME was on strike at the time, so they missed out on the big story. Sounds wrote some ludicrous piece about how they virtually deified Ian and said, this man died for you, and all this hyperbole.
He'd tried before, and people kind of knew he'd tried before, and it was very much obviously in just about every lyric he wrote, a sort of pattern, a prediction, a plan. So as much as it was completely shocking, there was also something that was almost appropriate about it and seemed to fit into the way that this weird thing was going.
When anybody dies young, the fans felt cheated because they were just about to break big and everybody was waiting for it, and there was a lot of anticipation. Then suddenly all that was taken away from us.
People like you find it easy, naked to see, walking on air, hunting by the rivers, through the streets, every corner.
Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, Stephen Morris and Rob Gretton were left to face a future without their figurehead and their friend.
Walk away in silence. Don't walk away.
Ian Curtis's death at 23 left the remainder of the band contemplating some fundamental choices. Should they, could they continue? And if so, in what form? As the last Joy Division single, Love Will Tear Us Apart, was achingly received by the fans, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, Stephen Morris and Rob Gretton grew even closer. Peter Hook.
We spent most of our time together talking about Ian.
Paul Morley.
One of the most amazing things about New Order, their music has an atmosphere about it because they were making it within the shock of Ian's suicide. And everything you do is still within that shock. And I often think that they were close enough to never really to get over it.
That's very, very true, but we're also in a state of having to find some way of surviving as human beings, you know. We didn't want to do anything else and couldn't do anything else. We had no other talent, you know. It was survival. For us to survive and have some sort of occupation, we had to carry on.
Hesitantly, the band reassembled and began to play gigs.
First time I saw them was in London at Heaven. I don't think they got on stage till about 2 o'clock in the morning. And you still weren't sure what was going on. What were they called? Well, who was singing?
I will say one thing that Rob did, which was absolutely very, very clever, was he got us out playing again when we weren't really ready. He said, "You've got to tour and book these dates so you're off." And we went to New York as a three-piece, and that was like the biggest, most difficult thing in the world. And then we had all the gear stolen. And so in many ways, we went as boys and came back as men, if you like.
They were just stunning as a three-piece. They were alarming. But then I can remember the next gig about 3 days later was Hurrahs on Manhattan. All three of them tried singing. Barney was probably the best, although I remember Barney, in order to be able to sing, had to drink 2 bottles of Pernod straight off before going on stage.
When Barney started singing, you were moved to tears. It was just such a wonderful moment that they'd had the bravery and the power to carry on. They were doing it from within. And you saw and heard something form already then. You realised that what had happened is that the hard rock of Joy Division had somehow melted, and the incandescent hole that Ian Curtis had left on stage was somehow filled with a kind of group unity.
Tony Wilson.
I just think it was this wonderful idea of Rob's pushing Barney centre stage and bringing in the drummer's girlfriend, who had already played with Joy Division a couple of times on guitar, I think once at Eric's in Liverpool, meant that the family wasn't disturbed, nothing was changed. I think that was really quite a profound moment of typical Gretton genius. And again, there was 5 members, this time with Gillian included.
The inclusion of Gillian Gilbert in the band was a surprise to many, maybe even to her. But she took the promotion in her stride, although she does confess to some early nerves.
But I suppose it was intimidating because joining a band that's already played music and learnt how to play it, and then you're sort of stuffed in the middle saying, right, come up with some guitar riffs or keyboard riffs where you've never done it before. I mean, in that way it was intimidating.
Rob just thought it was a great idea, and that was it. So she couldn't really play, which suited us well because we didn't want anybody that was going to come in and tell us what to do, really.
What appealed to me about Gillian was the way she was dressed quite smartly. She had her hair long and crimped, and she looked pretty different to average punk in them days.
instead of getting somebody who could play guitar and have like preconceived ideas, they thought they'd get somebody who, like them, at the start didn't know how to play, so you could sort of learn in a special way.
My role is to come up with ideas.
When you get an idea like that, you can see where Rob's coming from.
And so, in 1981, it was Bernard's plaintive monotone that surfaced on the new band's first release, Ceremony. As Joy Division, the band had been accused of Nazi tendencies, mainly because of how their name was represented. Now, the new band needed a new name.
We were the most unpoliticised group probably around at the time. I remember a journalist coming up to me in London after we played a gig there, and he asked me what my politics were, right wing or left wing. And I said to him, well, Grandad voted Labour, so I vote Labour. We're just unpoliticised, and people were trying to make us out to be Nazis.
We flirted with the imagery, but so did everybody else. Sex Pistols did it, Susie and the Banshees did it. They never got bloody... I mean, we still ask now about our Nazi thing. It's 25 years later. We've never done anything to promote it. But people still ask you about it.
It's just when you started out, people thought, right, what can we do to get up normal people's noses, you know?
Peter Saville, Factory's designer, has another explanation for those so-called fascist trappings.
They have a liking sometimes for the monumental and the powerful. So we end up with this very pure product which is power-based, and so people tend to say it looks very fascist. But ideologically it's not fascist at all.
You know when we put the name New Order I mean,
we walked right into that one as well, didn't we?
This is so ridiculous.
I actually got the idea from reading an article in The Guardian.
So Rob came in one day and he said, just read this article in The Guardian about Prince Sihanouk,
or whatever, of Cambodia, had formed an army called the New Order of the Armed Liberation Struggle of the People of Cambodia, or something like that.
He says, how about New Order?
I thought it was a pretty neutral name to have.
Is how unpolitical we were.
I didn't know it was totally identified with fascism or Nazis or whatever. It never occurred to me that people will think we were fascist anyway.
So we picked New Order, and then it was, they've done it again.
Mein Kampf.
Nazis. Hitler's Mein Kampf. What are they going on about?
New Order's first album, Movement, was released in 1981. The album generally continued the experimental and electronic approach of the Joy Division project, an approach which was particularly apparent on the track Everything's Gone Green. Here's Tony Wilson.
Well, having changed music once, they changed it again with these primitive early Apple Macs, soldered and wired up to keyboards to create modern music where melody and rhythm, the two great ingredients, Africa and Europe, of rock and roll, are actually welded into the same musical notation.
Everything's Gone Green is an interesting track because it is the first electronic track, and what we did was we worked in the studio and there was an old Oberheim synthesizer there and a drum box. We plugged it in and I started playing this. I said, Martin, how can we get this down on tape? Because there was no way of synchronising the tape in those days. And he said, oh well, we'll get Steve to put a drum track down and we'll trigger the synthesizer off Steve's hi-hat track from the VU meter somehow. He got a voltage out of the VU meter on the tape machine, we plugged it into the synth and it bloody worked. This was really interesting, it was like a fresh direction. You know?
Movement's progression won New Order another generation of fans. Amongst them a New York musician called Moby.
I went out and I bought that album and it was so interesting because the first song, Ceremony, is this very lovely melodic song and then the rest of the album just gets darker and darker.
Movement's somber sound partially reflected the mood of its producer Martin Hannett. Here's Bernard, Hooky and Stephen.
think perhaps he was really upset by what happened to Ian.
But he took it out on
He
us.
started taking tons of different kinds of drugs.
I don't think he wanted to be there.
By the time Movement was being done, they'd worked with Martin for 2.5 years. They were beginning to drift apart.
Martin made it 10 times more difficult movement for us than he should have done. He seemed to revel in the fact that we were all unhappy and go out of his way to make us more unhappy.
In the sound of Movement, it's not happy. The relationship between band and group has changed.
Stephen Morris.
I found a tape of an interview with him, and the question yesterday was, how do you regard your role as a producer? And he said, create a complex web of tensions inside the studio and the band. Which is what he did.
One of the other problems with Movement is that Barney was trying to write lyrics like Ian. That's not Bernard's personal voice.
It was like Son of Joy Division to me, Movement. And
It wasn't quite one thing or the other, was it?
It sounds very much like Joy Division, and you know, Barney's vocals on it even sound quite a bit like Ian Curtis. And then as New Order developed, they sort of sounded less and less like Joy Division and more just like New Order.
Photographer Kevin Cummins.
I think it took Bernard quite a while to develop a strong vocal style, but it should take a while because Bernard didn't start as a singer. It was difficult knowing whether to bring in a new vocalist or how it was going to work.
Here's Paul Morley.
Back then you were still thinking that New Order had made an album was brilliant. The fact they call it Movement was brilliant because it both kept up the movement and both stopped the movement dead and also created a movement. And you were listening to it in a different way. You weren't listening to it in the way that people listen to their music now. It was more that it had happened, and that it had happened in that way that seemed to suggest that they would keep going.
During the mixing of Movement, the band and Hannett parted ways, but New Order still acknowledged their debt to the legendary producer who died of a heart attack in 1991. Here's Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner.
He taught us how to do it.
I don't think he taught us how to do it. No, I think that he added a great sense of experimentation that perhaps we didn't have. We just wanted to get it down and wanted to sound like we did live.
And then
he taught us how to experiment.
Having dispensed with the services of Hannett, New Order were able to express themselves more freely. Tony Wilson.
I always point to the video of New Order performing at National Hall in New York, our first ever New Order live video. Their performance there of Temptation, it's only half written, and you've got Barney going, oh, I've got green eyes, you've got blue eyes, you've got grey eyes, and somewhere, as you watch him doing that, you're watching Bernard find his own voice. Almost a kind of nonsense poetry. Bernard was sort of straitjacketed for Movement, but then finds his own voice in Temptation.
In 1982, the same year as Temptation reached number 29 in the UK charts, Rob Gretton had the idea to open a nightclub in Manchester based on the New York clubs like Danceteria and the Funhouse. Using £70,000, mainly raised from the sales of Closer and Unknown Pleasures, Gretton, Wilson and their associates opened the Hacienda in a former yacht salesroom in Whitworth Street. This innovative and expensive project received a mixed reception.
Just like a feeling I need, it's no joke.
Here's Paul Morley with his first impressions of the Hacienda, formed on its opening night.
It was like a Peter Saville sleeve come to 3D life that you could stand inside, which was interesting. And it wasn't the band, it was a Gretton thing. He wanted to give something back to Manchester.
DJ Mike Pickering.
You know, we've been going around the world, seeing all these fantastic places in America, and it was like, well, let's build one here.
So he felt that so much had happened to the band because they come from Manchester, and what Manchester had given them, it gives something back. But for a while, it was a really odd club.
Here's Kev Cummins.
The club wasn't even full on its opening night, although that could be something to do with the fact that Tony Wilson thought having Bernard Manning opening the club would be a magnificently ironic gesture.
Some of the funniest things I've ever heard in my life are Stephen, Barney and Peter especially talking about the Hacienda.
The thing was is that we had nowhere, after being to New York, we had nowhere to go that was like those clubs. And Rob, in his infinite wisdom, said, why don't we open one? So he used all the money we made off Joy Division to open a frigging club and lost a lot. And then gave up all New Order's money into it. But we had our own club.
I love the Stephen one, but the opening night of the Hacienda, he went along and being Stephen, he queued up. This is the opening night of the Hacienda, which his band has paid for, his money has paid for. And he's queued up and he's not on the guest list. And he has to pay to get in. The whole idea of cocktails and a designer look was so far ahead of its time that it seemed, oddly at the time, old-fashioned. Now it's just everywhere, and Wilson would claim that it was because of him that it is everywhere, that it, you know, not Conran or something, but him. And that was what was so peculiar, that we were just inside a Peter Saville sleeve come to 3D Live, sipping cocktails, watching Orange Juice.
A lot of people, when they think of the Hacienda, they think Summer of Love, 14 million people on the dance floor on a Saturday night, and yet it wasn't like that at all. The Hacienda was almost like a private members club for people who worked for Factory Records and their friends. And we'd go there on a Friday night, and we loved it because there were 20 people in there. We could sit around and talk bollocks and go home.
For me, New Order were incredibly important culturally because they opened the Hacienda.
Journalist and critic Miranda Sawyer.
And they opened it when I was fairly young. And when I started to go there, it was much more acid house years. It was like 1984, 85, and it was empty. But it was a fantastic environment. And I remember thinking, this is what I wanted. I wanted to be able to go out, stay up late, and talk to people that thought differently from the place where I was brought up, which was very suburban and middle class. So I am eternally grateful. They saved my life. I think they're brilliant.
If we'd have opened it 6 years later, we wouldn't have lost all that freaking money.
Over the last few months, we've been using the internet to troll for questions from New Order fans all over the world. We put some of them to the band. Martin Johnson from London wants to know about the writing process. How do the band write songs?
The writing process is really, we do it two ways. We'll jam together, start with a drum beat and then lay stuff on top of the drum beat. And what'll tend to happen after that is we'll get like a couple of bars, and then we'll take that 2-bar section and make it into a song so it lasts 4 minutes. Then we'll go, right, does it need another bit? Yes, it needs another bit, and then scratch around and find the other bit until we got a backing track that I'm happy with as a vocalist that I can take home and work on the vocals to that backing track. Then I'll bring it in, sing the rest of them the vocal, and then we'll work on it some more and develop it more as a song.
Mark Fernall sent in a question about the film 24-Hour Party People, which he enjoyed very much. He wants to ask Hooky if he liked the movie and if actually visiting the set of the Hacienda brought back any memories.
Yeah, well, he did, because it was really weird, because it was exactly the same apart from the corners, and that's what made it seem like a dream. It was fantastic. It's like Bernard said, it was great to have a last night, because we never really got one. But when I was going over to get in, and Andrew Eaton was looking after the door, and they had the fire people there trying to shut it down because of the capacity. They had the police there because everyone was climbing over the walls. They had the gangsters trying to ram it with a car because they wanted to get in, and all the Salford lot trying to get in because they knew what was happening. And he said to me, he said, oh my God, he said, my nerves, I don't know. He said, was it like this at the Hacienda? And I went, every night, mate, for 15 years. And he went, oh my God. So it was great being in the Hacienda and letting somebody else worry about all that. You know, I was a bit annoyed the way the bloody comedians kidnapped the story of Manchester music, which was quite strange, but no, I'd say overall it was good. It was good for us.
Marina Slasky from Hobart wants to know about the meaning of New Order's lyrics. Marina asks, what's the purpose of a lyric?
What is the purpose of a lyric? The purpose of a lyric is to impart an idea or a message that you've got,
I mean,
you know, to the rest of the world. And in reality, you don't wake up every day with a message that you wish to impart to the world.
I think one of the strangest things to learn when we sort of split up and went off and did our own things was when I had to start writing. And I never realised how difficult it was. It was really difficult because you can hide behind your guitar, but for some strange reason, I mean, I know some vocalists do hide behind the voice, they're great with it, you know, the Lennoxes of the world, but it was very, very difficult. So,
well, also I'm quite a private person,
That's
you know,
what I mean.
and that's why a lot of my lyrics are ambiguous, because I don't really want people to know what I'm thinking, but unfortunately my job is to tell people what I'm thinking. So there's a bit of a, what is it, a dichotomy? What's the correct?
Well,
you got your English earlier.
Could be a dichotomy, could be a dilemma.
Whichever way you look at it.
Yeah, it's open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Like a lot of lyrics.
OK, thanks very much for all your questions. We'll put some more to the band next week in part 2 of TX New Order. In 1983, New Order released a 12-inch single that changed pop music forever and marked their own coming of age. Here's Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook.
We changed our sound just at the right time.
And looking back on it, we were taking a lot of chances.
When New Order arrived at their own sound, it was probably with Blue Monday.
New York musician Moby.
I mean, you certainly could never have imagined Joy Division making a disco song.
A lot of the audience felt betrayed when we did Blue Monday.
I think that's a popular myth. The myth is this, that you completely lost an audience when you did Blue Monday and gained another one, but there's people around who like Blue Monday and also like Joy Division stuff. Plenty of them.
Kevin Cummins.
I kind of wanted them to be Joy Division. I wanted them to progress that way, although it was obviously the direction they were going in.
It was the missing link between punk and the rave scene. And it was the visible, public example of a bridge between the experimental music of Neu! And Kraftwerk and Can and the intelligent dance music of Aphex Twin and Fortet.
Blue Monday sold 3 million copies worldwide. It fused electronics and dance beats with an icy sang-froid. Critic and journalist Miranda Sawyer.
I have to say that it's turned into like Bohemian Rhapsody. You know that thing where you know everything that's coming before it happens, so you can do all the action. That's awful, isn't it? I mean, it's so much better than Bohemian Rhapsody is like a joke.
Here's Paul Morley.
It's a long song that should have been short, and it's a song about death and about how lucky we are to be alive.
Mike Pickering.
They had to turn down so many televisions because they would never mind. And I remember they did Top of the Pops for Blue Monday and they insisted that they did it live. You can imagine the mayhem that it caused. And in fact, the record dropped in the charts the next week because it sounded shit.
How does it feel to treat me like you do? When you laid your hands upon me and told me who you are.
U2 were on. Bono came up to Rob and said, I think it's fantastic what you've done and I really wish we'd have done it. And Rob just went, yeah, but you didn't, did you?
Do I feel? Tell me now, how do I feel?
Whichever way you look at Blue Monday, it becomes more and more important in the history of rock that we like to write. You know, it becomes as important as anything by Elvis or the Velvet Underground.
It wasn't like a new wave band pretending to be a dance act. It was straightforward dance music, and you would go out to every club in New York and you would hear it mixed in with all the, you know, the black music.
Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys.
Bernard told me they were trying to play You Make Me Feel Mighty Real by Sylvester. If you think about it, it's the same chord change. At that point I was still working at Smash Hits, and Chris and I were working on the Pet Shop Boys in the evenings on the weekends.
Pet Shop Boys discovered the formula about the same time too.
And when I put that record on, I heard bum 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 bum. Tears almost came to my eyes. I thought, well, that's it. We've missed the boat. New Order have got there first.
It was just a really interesting time because it was basically white guys making dance music.
The drumming of the machine somehow takes over and creates a pulse that is so rhythmical that it becomes a dance rhythm. Previously, pretty much the area of black musicians, if you like, Sly and the Family Stone were getting it, and the white musicians couldn't really get it.
Up until that period in music, that had never really been the case.
Really, it was kind of gay disco, was that point.
DJ Dave Haslam.
So that record, if it was played at your discotheque, whether your discotheque was in Bradford, Weymouth or Ibiza, would have just sounded totally bizarre, but it would have worked.
One of the most famous stories concerning Blue Monday involves its expensive Peter Saville designed packaging. The record's cover was so intricate that its production costs exceeded the revenue from its sales. Result? Factory Records lost money on their biggest hit. Neil Tennant thinks this story is typical of Factory's self-spun myths.
Blue Monday Club was a totally brilliant idea. I mean, in many ways, it's a slightly corny idea because Peter Saville obviously thought this record is very computerised sound to me, so I'm going to give it the packaging of a floppy disk. Can I just say I've never believed the story that they lost money on every single record. So I simply don't believe that. And then, of course, New Order went to record in New York. They noticed that the hip-hop music coming out of New York, produced mainly by Arthur Baker, was very much influenced by Kraftwerk. A lot of that early hip-hop music was very electro. And so New Order went over there, and that was very interesting.
New Order increasingly looked to New York's dance scene for direction. That scene had roots in a DIY aesthetic similar to that of the UK punk movement which had spawned the band. Hacienda DJ Dave Haslam explained.
The weird thing about 1976 was, although it was the summer of punk, and that's how it's remembered in British music history, it was also the very, very beginnings of electro and hip-hop. In the middle of 76, Grandmaster Flash and Melly Mel got together and started making what became hip-hop. That whole culture started in New York, in the Bronx, and out of that grew something which turned out to be more important than punk. It had the same DIY ethic, but what it had was a dance floor sensibility and a party sensibility. And that New York electro hip-hop scene influenced a lot of European musicians working in the post-punk era, because once punk had gone through that 3-minute thrash about, it was looking for a new direction. And bands like New Order began to take on that other influence of New York, the electro influence.
The band hooked up with Arthur Baker, then the doyen of the New York electronic dance floor sound. Baker's New York focused New Order, and they created a follow-up to Blue Monday, the Arthur Baker-produced Confusion. Here is Arthur Baker, producer and entrepreneur.
Culturally, they just saw New York and saw like a different part of New York than they probably saw when they were just sort of looking as a rock band. Basically, we went to like gay clubs, the Paradise Garage or the Funhouse, and obviously that's why they did the Hacienda, because they saw like the New York club scene and how great it was and how everyone would have a great time.
Club scene was much more vibrant. They had an 18 limit on it, so there was loads of young kids going out, and
the clubs were clubs. So that was where the idea for the Hacienda came from. It was just a lot of people getting together and having a great time, and we really enjoyed it. And then you come back to England.
Come back to England, and the clubs would be like people fighting, because everyone was dead chilled out in New York. They were great.
Tony Wilson.
Arthur was a wonderful moment of progression for them after Blue Monday to take it a stage further.
Here's Neil Tennant.
Arthur Baker had a particular style of melody, even. You can hear that in Confusion.
He put us in the studio for like a couple of days and said, write something. And basically he was saying, write something to order.
We'd always go in the studio with the song more or less finished. Bizarre, because we I don't know, we just really didn't know what to do. He really dropped us in at the deep end. We were just jamming like the way we normally do, and we ended up with a massive pile of tapes. About 15 hours worth of jams, because he'd left us there for about 3 days.
Most of it was
crap, wasn't it?
switching the synthesizer programs,
God,
trying to find a
jamming
good
as
sound.
well, yeah. We thought he'd listen to it, pick bits out, and we'd develop them the way we normally do.
As I remember, they sent me a bunch of stuff which I probably didn't even listen to, because I wanted to just go in and write stuff with them. And basically, I sort of stood over them.
And you went, I'm not doing that.
I'm not listening to 15 hours worth of tapes. Go into the studio,
so
make something up.
Just go in the studio, make something up. So we literally went into the studio with nothing and started playing the instruments. And everyone was like, but I mean, it worked.
Hooky claims he was really intimidated. I was just sort of standing over them, waiting for them to do something. And the thing was, they thought I was a Flash producer, and I thought they were a Flash band, and neither of us were Flash at all.
We thought the guy is obviously going to be some kind of musical genius, really good at what he does, man. He's going to know, he's going to be really sorted. And when you went in the studio with him, he didn't know what he was doing. He was just doing it. He was just, hey, try that, man, try this, whoa, push it all up, whoa, whatever. And the engineer was going, oh, calm down, you know. But he was like another mad professor.
Hookie's a mad professor. We're all mad professors. Steve's a mad professor. He's a mad professor. Barney's a mad gym teacher? No.
Confusion reached number 12 in the UK charts. Neil Tennant again.
Actually, Confusion is a slightly disappointing record. I think Confusion followed Blue Monday as a release, and it seemed very exciting going from Blue Monday to Arthur Baker produced track. But actually, the song I don't think is that great.
Where I think we're similar is for having these records that were like made with all this technology, and actually most of these things were played by hand, and there would be like 2 machines, and it was more the excitement of being able to have a machine play a beat, basically, and then trying to make everything in time with that perfect beat.
To take on board something which had the beat of Donna Summer was incredibly brave in that very circumscribed post-punk world where you were a rock band and you hated disco. And they crossed that line very unself-consciously, and without trying to sound like a disco band, and without trying to sound like an electro band. They just absorbed the influence.
It was just the excitement of the drum machine, of having this thing that you could play around with and do things that a drummer couldn't do, and keep it in time, and the sound was cleaner, and it was just, you know, it was easy. You could experiment with it.
Mike Pickering.
For me, that's the immortal line in that is rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat-a, hey. Rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat-a, hey. I mean, that's so tongue-in-cheek, isn't it?
Since working with Arthur, I think that put, pardon the French, put a rocket up our arse. And sort of thought, well, you know, sometimes you do have to go into the studio and write. It would be handy if you could go in the studio and write a song to order.
After working with Baker, New Order embarked upon a creative spree rarely equalled in their long career. They produced 2 albums in 2 years, dance-oriented Low Life in 1985 and their first top 10 album Brotherhood in 1986. Plus, they crafted a handful of dance-inspired pop singles like Perfect Kiss, Subculture, Shell Shock, State of the Nation and Bizarre Love Triangle. But these singles made less impact on the UK charts than they deserved because of Factory's woeful promotional and distribution setup. Mike Pickering.
They didn't have promotion. In later years, they finally got some, but there was no promotion of early Factory. Daytime radio didn't play New Order. It was very underground.
However, when Miranda Sawyer was asked by the band to select hits for inclusion in their 2002 collection Retro, the journalist drew heavily from this period in New Order's history.
I was doing basically the pop things, you know, the greatest hits, the ones that everybody likes. And I was really pleased to do that because it's just everyone is a winner. It's like, you can't beat them, really. And Bizarre Love Triangle is definitely a song that makes you go, woo, it's just a great record.
The 1985 single Perfect Kiss took 6 months to complete, but the result was another inspired fusion of the emotions and the intellect, the brains and the beat.
I think they were trying to do a kind of pop with meaning, and that you can also dance to.
That also comes in the middle crowd-pleasing section.
looking back on it, there are some great achievements. I mean, Perfect Kiss is a remarkable song. I was astonished when I found out it's actually the world's first song about AIDS. Perfect Kiss is the kiss of death. Pretending not to see his gun, I said, let's go out and have some fun.
They make records which football hooligans can like and students can like, as Bernard has said himself, and that is really, really hard to achieve. There's very, very few people that have done that. And they make records that are contained within an art environment, you know. I mean, some of the stuff that they come up with is genuine art, and yet they still make records that are about kind of inarticulate kind of emotion as well. They're not kind of stupid, which sounds very stupid, but they're really not stupid, and that's very important.
As well as winning them new fans, New Order's string of intelligent dance-oriented releases readjusted the perception of the fans who'd supported them from their early Joy Division days. New Order had become a big-ticket attraction. One of the first indicators that the band's icy and aloof image was melting was provided by photographer Kevin Cummins' Sounds front cover from 1983. Kev's cover shot portrayed the members of New Order sunbathing by a swimming pool.
Well, we were staying at the Holiday Inn in Washington. Prior to that, all the pictures of New Order had all been dark and moody. But now it's a bit like being on holiday, and it was hot and sunny, it was July, and I did these pictures of them lying by the pool. They looked like pasty English kids abroad. That was the idea, really. Because they'd only ever been in dark rooms for years. That was the first time they'd seen the sun since 1976.
Well, some of the crowd are on the pitch.
By 1986, New Order had well and truly thrown off Joy Division's long raincoat and were at last able to bask in the sunshine of a bright future. I'm Mark Radcliffe. Thanks for listening to the first part of TX New Order on BBC Radio 2. In part 2, we conclude our examination of the most influential British band of the modern era. We'll track their triumphs and hear how they react to another tragic death in the family. And we'll see how they achieve worldwide recognition and witness how they fall apart and then piece themselves back together with their top comeback album, Get Ready. Evening all, I'm Mark Radcliffe, and welcome to the second part of TX New Order. Now then, let's remind you of our previous landmark broadcast. By the mid-80s, New Order had become cult superstars, able to fill 30,000-seat venues by virtue of their unique and pioneering fusion of rock, pop and electronic dance beats. Their song Blue Monday was the best-selling 12-inch single ever. Moby called it one of the most influential tunes of all time, and he's not thick. After Blue Monday, they went on to carve a niche with sharp, intelligent pop singles, and some thought-provoking, body-bending albums like Low Life, Power, Corruption and Lies and Brotherhood. But the band's success hadn't come easily. The beginning of the 80s had dealt New Order the hardest of knocks when, as Joy Division, they'd lost their charismatic singer Ian Curtis, who hanged himself on the eve of their first scheduled American tour. However, under the guidance of their friend and manager Rob Gretton, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, Gillian Gilbert and Stephen Morris had been able to regroup and retune their sound. But still there lingered a feeling that Factory Records' biggest stars hadn't yet fulfilled their undoubted promise. It was time for them to deliver. Journalist and critic Miranda Sawyer.
If you say to somebody, New Order, then if they don't say Blue Monday, they'll say, oh, I feel so extraordinary. I like that one. What's that one called?
I feel so extraordinary. Something's got a hold on me.
True Faith was New Order's biggest commercial breakthrough since Blue Monday. The song's roots lay in the twisty-twirly business practices of Factory Records and the Hacienda, the Manchester super club the group co-owned together with Rob Gretton and sundry other associates. Inspired by New York's dance clubs, the Hacienda had a difficult birth when it opened in the depressed post-punkery of early 80s Manchester. The club, as they say, was ahead of its time. So far ahead, in fact, that very few punters bothered going. It was in this context that New Order needed a greatest hits package. Factory Records boss Tony Wilson.
True Faith was on Substance, and True Faith and Substance between them made New Order and Factory a lot of money, all of which was then swallowed up by the Hacienda.
I think the Hacienda needed some dough or something.
Factory couldn't pay us, so we decided to do a greatest hits LP, which was going to sell loads because we were pretty big, and take a reduced royalty.
So we thought, we'll do this greatest hits thing, and then we had wouldn't it be nice if we did another track for this greatest hits thing?
So we actually went in with Stephen Hague, the producer, and we sat down and tried to write a top 40 hit.
The new producer, Stephen Hague, was a proven hitmaker. His back catalogue included the Pet Shop Boys and Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. He'd also been at the mixing desk for Malcolm McLaren's foray into dance opera Madame Butterfly. Here's Neil Tennant.
He had his own kind of vision of New Order, I think, and it's much more of a radio-friendly version.
Stephen Hague.
Perhaps one thing that I brought to it was to try and keep the length of the tracks down to radio size. Producing any real band, you have to find a place for yourself in the existing structure of things. And Rob Gretton in the studio, I really felt like I was being watched for the first few days to make sure I wasn't going to turn them into Pet Shop Boys or something like that.
He's a very good pop producer, Stephen Hague. But he's very good, particularly working with someone who's got a real rock integrity and just making it slightly more radio-friendly. And that's actually a quality that's not always admired these days, but it's a really strong quality, and it really works, I think, with New Order.
I've always considered them to be a pop band with a rock bass player.
Peter Hook of New Order.
You had the idea for True Faith, didn't you, before you went in with Stephen Hague?
I had the idea for that repetitive bass line, but I got it from in New York. Someone used to send me cassettes of Kiss FM. I remember on one tape was Holiday by Madonna, and it had that rhythm for the bass line. It was a different tune, but it had that rhythm, and I just thought that's a great rhythm.
Together with Hague, the band worked up the song in the studio. The video that accompanied it made commercial success a certainty. Not even Factory could mess this one up. Music journalist Paul Morley explains.
The early 80s and the arrival of MTV, when everything changed, it became driven by video. But New Order, because of their support system, they managed to fit into that brilliantly by realising that the video didn't necessarily have to be a banal advertisement for its own song.
The True Faith video was produced by Michael Schamberg from Factory Records' US office. Its vision of padded Pierrots doing a kind of post-apocalyptic It's a Knockout came from Schamberg's recruit, choreographer Philippe Decoufflet. Here's Neil Tennant.
It's basically a piece of contemporary dance, isn't it? Filmed in those outrageous costumes. But it's a great record. It's got that quality which is really important in New Order song. An almost childlike sincerity. And also, you know, Bernard, when his lyrics are good, are really, really good. Something really simple, like when I was a very small boy, very small boys talked to me.
In 1988, True Faith won the Brit Award for Best Music Video, and the song reached number 4 in the UK, the band's biggest hit to date. More importantly, the success of True Faith helped the hits package Substance sell in large numbers. This in turn enabled New Order to exploit their back catalogue for the relatively new CD market. Substance reached number 3 in the album charts, and New Order were magically repositioned in the public eye as a great singles band.
I used to think that the day would never come. See the lightning machine of the morning sun, and morning sun is the drug that brings me in to a childhood I lost.
New Order had obviously struck a commercial vein, but it was soon to make a pop record that would score on a massive scale. Over to you, Barry.
Thanks, Mark. In 1990, New Order recorded the greatest football anthem ever, and certainly the first in the genre worth listening to. Here's funny hardman actor Keith Allen.
It was New Order's only ever #1, which is kind of hilarious.
Sawyer?
I might to make the point that it went to #1, not Pavarotti. Because everyone just goes, oh, Pavarotti went to number 1, and it didn't. World in Motion did.
Now Morley.
The only thing that went wrong was that we didn't win the World Cup on the back of it, because it was such a great song, it pushed us to the semi-final. If we get a great song next time, then we could well win it.
On to Cummins.
We used to sit at home, play World in Motion at top volume, watch football on the telly, get overexcited and have to go out to Italy and go to a game. It was great. I loved it. Absolutely loved it.
Back to Morley.
In that world of the football song, the fact that it was an intelligent song, unusually put together, really helps create a different kind of sensibility, a different world.
Alan again.
The key word here is cool. The New Order are cool. And also you've got to remember Italy was cool then. It was a very cool World Cup.
Now Sawyer.
It was one of the things that made football acceptable to the chattering classes. Meaning that before they thought it was for plebs, and after that it became acceptable for slightly posher, clever people to go and watch football.
Cummins!
World in Motion and Gazza's Tears. People don't remember much else from Italia 90.
When the nation looked up in 1990, we realised that England actually had a chance of winning the World Cup. In the end, Bobby Robson's Red and White Army went out to Germany on penalties after a tense semi-final. It was an emotional time for me, and also for a few million Lager Up fans back in the UK. New Order provided the soundtrack for that long Italian summer, which was ironic given that Rob Gretton was the only person connected with the band to have any real interest in football. And according to my recollection, there weren't any Man City players in the England team at that time, unless it was Peter Barnes who played on the wing. No, that was another guy, sorry. It was Factory's cultured midfield schemer, Tony Wilson, who began the move.
A guy called Bloomfield rang me up from the FA and said, we'll do the World Cup single. I thought, what a great idea.
Guy at the FA says, I've got to do the bloody World Cup record. It's doing me head in. Tony simply said to him, why don't you use a band that you like? And he asked us to do the World Cup song.
Prior to World in Motion, a football record was get the players in the studio and get them all to sing along to some dirge. Suddenly, we had a football record by maybe the hottest band at the time. It was mad.
It was Bernard's genius to bring in Keith Allen, so that really annoys me that, in fact, Bernard quite rightly gets the credit for finding the right person to write the lyrics.
Express yourself, create the space, you know you can win.
I was in the Hacienda one night, and I was talking to Tony about it, and I'd written, well, I told him I'd written the first verse. Of course I hadn't, I just made it up there and then, and it was. E is for England, England starts with E. We'll all be smiling when we're in Italy. So of course Tony fell about laughing. I said, well, I'll give it a go. And sent it off to the record company, and they immediately replied that you are joking. We can't do this.
Bernard Sumner.
When we recorded in London and we'd go back after the studio, we used to watch all the comic strip things, and we were very impressed by the Yob, and we started seeing Keith in the Yob. And also we'd been to a party at my house, which I'd been impressed with his lady pulling talent.
In you come, Casanova.
Bernard had included all the stuff about Love's Got the World in Motion, which I didn't know, which is the best part of the song.
And what about that Yobby England chant we all enjoyed so much?
Bernard was in a hotel, being ill. Me and Tony Wilson got in a car, and Tony drove over to Henley, to this hotel, to pick up Bernard. Tony had a tape of the work in progress so far, and there was this phrase, dun 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 dun. I said, Tony, I've got it, England. And he said, don't be so bloody stupid. I said, no, it's dun 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 dun, England. And as I did that, Bernard picked up a Boots plastic bag and peeked into it. So we went in and said to Stephen Hague, here it is, we've got this bit now, dun, 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 England. But Stephen Hague, bless his heart, totally just didn't stop. Looked at it, yep, that works. And then the screeching of tyres and highly tuned engines signalled the arrival of 6 England players in their Mercedes.
And when I walked in, the football players had just arrived, and they had each had a bottle of champagne.
There's Steve McMahon, Gazza, Peter Beardsley, Chris Waddle, Des Walker, and John Barnes.
The England squad were told to go to a recording studio to make the record, and only 5 turned up, as is the wont, because normally England songs finish at number 50 and then nothing's really heard of it, so some of the players decided to go to the pub instead. So only 5 of us turned up for it. just came in, got completely leathered. It took about 3 hours. Everybody was just drunk, and I thought we sounded really terrible.
They reached the point where they were all getting quite manic and hard to control, and so I was encouraging them to drink more, and that seemed to calm them down a little bit. I found that was the easiest point to work with them.
And then we had to decide on who was going to do the rap.
I imagined that I would record each football player doing the whole rap and then intercut so that it kept changing between players, and it was going to be this tumbling thing that was going to be a lot of fun.
Des Walker's the worst. I mean, just dreadful. Absolutely no sense of rhythm whatsoever. And then, of course, you expected Steve McMahon to be crap, and he was.
It was just terrible. Oh my God! You know, they're football players.
And then Gazza went in, and I have to say, Gazza was the best. And also, Gazza was the best dancer, actually. He was a really good dancer. Gazza, at that time, was at his most Tourette's-like worst, you know, in his life. I mean, he was just bonkers. He drank 3 bottles of champagne in an hour and a half. And, of course, nobody could understand one word that he said. You know, not a word. You got to hold on, give on, and read him. You got to be smart, get the lean. But rhythmically, it was absolutely spot on.
Barnes was the one who brought just enough swagger and self-confidence to it that we were able to use it.
I mean, it was either me, Paul Gascoigne, Chris Waddle, or Stuart Pearce, or Peter Beardsley. Of course, I did it. It was between me and Des, and I got to do it. John Barnes, 574 league appearances, 11 goals from 79 England caps, but only one UK #1 hit. Ultimately, a little disappointing after such a distinguished career. Back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Barry. With World in Motion, New Order, not for the first time, caught the mood of the moment. The single benefited not only from England's success, but also from the global marketing campaign for Italia 90. Keith Allen again.
It was the first World Cup that became a televisual kind of brand, if you like. And also, it was a very hot summer, and it was the summer of love. Look, I mean, let's get serious here. Ecstasy altered the profile of football. There's no two ways about it. More so than anything else. And as I say, that tune just had a foot very firmly in both camps, which was terrace culture and club culture, and that was the genius of it, and nobody could have planned that. It was just a wonderful fortuitous accident, you know.
2 years before World in Motion accidentally got them to #1, New Order began to make the album that many fans regard as their finest moment. And like World in Motion, it demonstrated that they were totally in tune with the spirit of the times. It was called simply Technique, and the first single from it was Fine Time. Here's photographer Kevin Cummins.
When Technique came out, I thought it was the greatest album of the decade. It captured the zeitgeist, as we were fond of saying at the NME.
The best way to write a great album is to have a great time making it.
They knew what an E was, and it was right at the centre of their music.
Miranda Sawyer.
Technique is an Ibiza LP. It was made, conceived in Ibiza, and that is about all the humour and the wildness and the sex and love and fantasticness that goes with having a great time in a nightclub and lovely weather. That's what that's about. It's not really much more to it than that.
Here's Paul Morley.
And to call it Technique, and to have a sleeve like that, you know, it's no wonder that they're the greatest group that's ever been. Everything is all just put together in this wonderful formula that never was a formula until they did it.
It was on heavy rotation in my house.
The hedonistic club culture that New Order loved to enjoy played a part in their choice of a studio venue. Stephen Morris.
There was 2 studios in the frame. There was Real World Studio, which is Peter Gabriel's state-of-the-art studio in Bath. And then there was this other studio in Ibiza. So Oki went to check out the studio in Ibiza, and me and Rob went to check out Peter Gabriel's in Bath. And Peter Gabriel's in Bath, fantastic. Well, Oki came back and said, no matter how fantastic Peter Gabriel's is, this one in Ibiza is more fantastic. And he was right, but for completely different reasons.
Mike Pickering from the Hacienda was DJing in Ibiza at the same time.
Well, they had this big villa with a big swimming pool, and it was really nice.
I know what we'll do. We'll just go to the club tonight, We'll come back about 12 and then we'll do some work.
Just go for one drink.
And then we'll just go for one drink. So we go to the club and get back at 12 the next day. Spend
Sleep
all day in
all day.
bed, and then we go, oh, feel a bit tired, not going to be able to write anything. What should we do? Should we go to that club? We'll go again, we'll go on this, and it just went on like this.
And it was patently obvious from the moment you walked in that nothing was going to get done.
Then at night, of course, when we and him supposed to be going in, Andy, our manager, comes, we've got free tickets to this club down the road.
And we were like that going, studio, loads of scantily clad women. Studio, loads of scantily clad women.
So we
Scantily
go.
clad women.
There was no morning, day or night. I mean, it's just beautiful nihilistic mayhem, you know.
Steve doesn't like the sun. Literally sit with all his winter clothes on in the sun. Ucky absolutely adores it, right? What we decided was, right, Steve doesn't like it, so we'll get him to do the drum tracks during the day and we'll go in at night. We get out by the pool, we've had our breakfast, sipping our cocktails, then we get a call from the studio, the engineer. Steve's he's finished the drums, he wants you to come and listen. We're like, oh, gee, tell him we'll come in when we've finished our cocktails. And we go and like, no, the hi-hats don't sound right. Herman, same again.
Factory boss Tony Wilson went to Ibiza to check on his investment. When he arrived, he found the island packed with partying Mancunians invited over by the band, including another of his acts on Factory, the Happy Mondays. Peter Hook.
Tony Wilson turned up on the 4th month. He listened to the stuff and he went, okay, this is the most expensive holiday you've ever had. And that was the only thing he said about it. Then he went back to England and we had to come home with our tail between our legs and basically start again.
I think there was about 2 drum tracks and a sequence that it came back with. I think that people go, oh, that must have been a disaster. But I don't think it was, actually, because when they came back, everything that they'd experienced in that time, then when they calmed down a bit, were able to make a great record from.
New Order finished the album at Peter Gabriel's studio in Bath. The album entered the UK chart at number 1. Fine Time reached number 11 in the hit parade. Predictably, the Factory organisation squabbled over its follow-up. DJ Dave Haslam.
Tony and Rob Gretton had a big argument about what the single should be, and the 2 singles that were taken off it were Fine Time and Round and Round. Everyone said to Tony, Vanishing Point is the track that will do it, and he said that he would resign as chairman of Factory Records if the other singles didn't go top 20, and they didn't, and he resigned as chairman of Factory Records.
Whatever the performance of the singles, technique put New Order back at the core of youth culture. They became the godfathers of the rave movement, which was happening right on their doorstep. Hooky.
But then we got back to Manchester, walked in the Hacienda, it was like Ibiza. When we went to Ibiza, it was deserted, nobody was in it. And then when we came back from Real World, it was like Ibiza.
When they came back, it was hysteria, I think, in Manchester at the time.
Manchester was well into a new era. By the time Technique came out, we were just surfing an ecstasy wave.
Kevin Cummins.
Suddenly everybody in Manchester had discovered a drug that made them happy instead of a drug that made them sit in a corner depressed. And everybody was going out and staying up all night and going to raves in fields and then going back to the Hacienda, and the Hacienda was having all-dayers and all-nighters, and it just seemed like 24-hour party town, really.
People would just go on after the Hacienda and it would just be a big old space somewhere in North Manchester, some dump, and they would carry on there, you know. But I mean, Bernard used to got great stories about that. He used to end up going to some place and it would just literally be a warehouse.
Paul Morley again.
Suddenly New Order, who in a way had been off on their own little journey for so long, and it was wonderful and fabulous and they gave us great records, suddenly seemed to be the godfathers of a movement, which again I think contributes to the fact that they never seem to go out of fashion. They just seem to have those moments when they're just either right on a beat that's happening in underground areas, but by the time it comes into the surface, New Order seem to be the champions of it.
It blended seamlessly into all the American stuff that Mike Pickering and Dave Haslam and Andrew Berry, everybody at the Hacienda was playing.
To be honest, everyone who worked at the Hacienda and everyone who went to the Hacienda and everyone involved in Manchester wasn't really bothered about the Manchester scene. It was kind of made up by the NME and London journalists, but no one there was bothered about it. In fact, the comment you'd hear the most was, well, that's the end of that then.
For the first time, you could go to the Hacienda and start looking at all the £10 notes building up in reception and behind the bar. Suddenly the club was profitable. At last it was doing what they wanted it to do, which was to be full.
But after a party, there's always a hangover. Kev Cummins on the downer.
I think everything started to be done to excess because it could be, and I think that's when it started falling apart.
But before the big come down, here's New Order answering some of the questions you sent to us via the wonderful World Wide Web. One gentleman from Verona, going by the name of Ennio, writes wanted to know if Hooky enjoyed his solo work with Revenge and Monaco.
I enjoyed it. It was a nice to do thing. I was reading the thing about Dave Garn. The guy was asking why I'd done a solo LP, and he said, well, I just wanted some enthusiasm. And I think that the thing in New Order was there was very little enthusiasm for anything that we did, and what happened was that because my main love was playing and travelling, I got the enthusiasm back for doing that. So basically I just went out and got some kids who had enthusiasm and we went off and did it. I mean, I appreciate Bernard's and Stephen Gillian's point of view now, but I went off and I really enjoyed it. And Monaco was slightly different because it became less band-like, which in retrospect I didn't enjoy as much because I enjoy being in a group.
Scott Newman from New York would like to know where the band get their ideas.
Usually they come out of thin air. 80% of the time they come out of thin
reading
air.
about this songwriter in the magazine, and he said some songs come out of thin air, and I thought, well, which are the ones
Where
that
do the rest
don't?
of
Where
them
do the other
come
ones
from?
come from? Unless you rip them off somebody. It was quite a strange quote.
Yeah, but
unless
sometimes
you get a melody
you
in
can't
your
actually sit down and go, right, I'm going to write a song today. In Joy Division, we used to sit around for weeks, you know, nothing had happened. Then bingo, something had happened.
Callie from Oxfordshire wants to know how Barney comes up with his lyrics.
I usually start about 5 o'clock and then slowly get drunk through the evening and then finish at about 2:30 in the morning with a song, really. It's a very, very intense thing to do, you know, it's really, really hard work and not very pleasant at all. And I'm just trying to find a different way of doing it at the moment.
Ian Bell writes about New Order's only #1 record, and he asks, if you were remaking World in Motion, which contemporary footballer would you get to do the John Barnes rap?
Well, we did, when we came to do the remix for the World Cup this time, which we got the go-ahead for, we did ask Beckham. But when we came to do it, the FA had an exclusivity with bloody Anthony Deck. So we didn't feel that there was any purpose to doing it without Beckham. I mean, it was a shame it wasn't to be, so we thought, well, we're not going to mess with it. If it's not going to be perfect, don't even bother.
Thanks very much for all your questions. Now back to the rest of the show. In 1989, New Order toured America. The strain took a toll and cracks began to show in their personal relationships and in their attitude towards their record company. Bernard Sumner.
We were overdoing it on tour, really, especially in America. It affected our relationship with one another. Moods were up and down, and you didn't want to be in a certain place, and you were thinking, why am I doing something I don't want to do? Being a musician is supposed to be about personal freedom, and I don't seem to have any. For me, those are the issues, you know.
Mike Pickering.
I was DJing on most of that tour. We played San Diego, an outdoor festival thing in a college grounds, and there was New Order, De La Soul and Public Image. It came off the stage. It was so hot that they had to put the stuff over where my records were because they were melting. And then we had a 26-hour party. I DJ'd for about 18 hours in this backstage area, which, when I think about it now, I think that's physically impossible, but we did it.
Sister Ray said I love you. Sister Ray said I love you.
And physically, we were getting into the acid house period. You were burning the candle at all ends within the band, and then in your recreation, you were doing the same thing, going to acid house parties and raves and stuff.
Can't remember any of it either.
Basically, you turned into a hedonist pig.
Everyone just completely wasted themselves, and what turned into a fantastic time, and everyone got home. There was just no one wanted to see each other again, and it completely fell apart, really. I mean, it was one of the best times I've ever had, but you know, you always pay for good times.
Miranda Sawyer.
They were driving each other absolutely crazy, and they needed to part, and they never really split up. They just didn't speak. It was over for a while.
Paul Morley.
I'm always staggered when I think about it that they made 5 albums in the 80s, plus Substance. What was happening around them? The death of Ian, Tony Wilson's madness, Rob Gretton's perverse way of managing the band that always seemed to lead them in odd directions. They resisted all of that, but eventually it impacted on them.
Hooky.
Well, you seem to be working and achieving nothing because the Hacienda and the factory were draining you. We still don't know to this day how many records we sold, because nobody at factories ever told us.
Factory Records boss Tony Wilson.
There was a period when we grew so fast we lost precise amounts. By somewhere in 87 we were able to do full accounting for the entire period, but that's fine. One expects to be criticised by one's musicians over money, because if there's one thing musicians don't understand, it's money.
As Barney quite rightly says, we're musicians. We just play and write and get pissed and fall over. They were the people that were looking after it all, and I think it was beyond them, really. I mean, it was a fantastic thing. It was part of the punk ethic, wasn't it?
The members of the band drifted apart and sought inspiration elsewhere. Mike Pickering.
They'd all fallen out, and they didn't want to do New Order, but they didn't want to stop making records. So they all did their solo projects.
Bernard Sumner's Electronic was the most successful of these. He teamed up with Johnny Marr, formerly guitarist of the Smiths, and invited contributions from Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys.
My involvement with electronics started because I heard from Mark Farrow, our designer, that Bernard Sumner was making a solo album. And I said, oh, tell him I'll do a track with him. And Bernard phoned him up, and he said, yeah, I'm doing it with Johnny Marr, it'd be great. And then I said to Chris, you've got to come as well. I'm not going by myself. I'd never been to Manchester before.
Neil Tennant was very involved in that. I mean, it was almost like a cross between New Order and the Pet Shop Boys, and that's where you would end up with that kind of, you know, Noel Coward-esque vocals, and I don't know. It was like the meeting point between the two, really.
Chris and I both went down, and we started to write a song immediately that went on the first album. It's called The Patience of a Saint.
Electronic's first album reached #1 in 1991. Peter Hook formed Revenge with guitarist Dave Hicks and keyboard player Chris Jones. Revenge didn't achieve the success of Electronic, but a later Hooky outfit, Monaco, which he formed with Dave Potts, scored a top 10 album Music for Pleasure.
When all my thoughts have left with you.
Change, as they say, is as good as a rest. Hooky.
It was a real liberation, and I'll have to thank Bernard for that, because it was his idea. Because I think I'd have just stuck with New Order and been miserable for the rest of my life if I hadn't gone out. I really enjoyed it. I think Monaco had some great gigs. Revenge, actually, were a far better live band than they were in the studio. I just wish I'd have written the album and then recorded it after we'd played. Because by the time we got to playing the songs, it was so much better.
Not to be outdone, Stephen Morris and Gillian Gilbert began scoring TV and movie themes, such as Shooting Stars and Making Out. and, working under the ironic name The Other Two, released the single Tasty Fish.
One day I'll go out walking. I don't know when, could be anywhere. Send a letter 'cause I'm sick of talking. Send my love, you know I won't be there. It's gonna last forever, and there's nothing I can do. Get yourself together.
But the most commercially successful New Order spin-off remained electronic. Their single Getting Away With It reached number 12 in 1989, while Get the Message got to number 8. Neil Tennant recalls writing the first hit as a guarded tribute to another grizzled warrior of the Mancunian music scene.
I had Getting Away With It in my notebook as a song title. And what was interesting is I wrote the lyrics from the point of view of Morrissey. I don't know if I even told Bernard this. It is actually written from the point of view of being Morrissey. I've been walking in the rain just to get wet on purpose.
I've been walking in the rain just to get wet on purpose.
I've been forcing myself not to forget, just to feel worse. I've been getting away with it all my life.
Getting away with it all my life. Getting away. However I look, it's clear to see that I love you more than you love me. However I look,
It's kind of like me doing Morrissey.
I love you more than you love me.
But New Order's solo projects were always tinged with a kind of disappointment for fans and friends. As Kevin Cummins and Mike Pickering explain.
All the component parts make New Order great. By all going off and having solo projects, there was one component part missing, and that was the thing that stopped any of those records being that great. Electronic were fun, but you really wanted Hooky to turn up halfway through it. The longer you listen to the electronic album, the more you realised he wasn't going to turn up.
I did remixes of all their solo projects, actually. It was quite funny, really, because you had the 3 or 4 elements of New Order separately recording, with Revenge, the other two, and electronic. Straight away you just thought, well, you know what, if you put all these together, you'd have a great record again.
That next great record was a long time coming. But in 1993, New Order eventually released the album Republic. The album had a difficult gestation. While apart, the band had developed differing ideas about the process of making music. This fundamental disagreement was exacerbated by the enmity some members of the band felt towards others. On top of that, Factory Records and the Hacienda were both heading down the Swanee. Producer Stephen Hague found himself in the middle of a lot of arguments.
As the sessions for Republic were starting, Hooky and I had talked quite a lot about doing that thing that they hadn't done for a while, which was getting in a room together and playing and recording lots of stuff. But we couldn't get the whole band together to do it. Barney wasn't interested. To his credit, he was really starting to think of himself as a proper songwriter. So I was walking the tightrope between those two camps.
Maybe I've forgotten the name and the address of everyone I've ever known. There's nothing I regret. Save it for another day. It's the schoolers and the kids have run away.
But New Order fans had waited a long time. There was a pent-up demand for the album which sent Republic straight to number 1. The record's best track was the single Regret, and that's not just my opinion.
Regret is really good because it's a very adult kind of song, you know, it's very much written by someone in his 30s. And also as a record, that cut-up guitar thing at the start is brilliant. And it's got a lovely melody. There's this kind of New Order style of melody. And this is a really, really good example of it. And it's a very moving song, like all the best New Order songs, it's really, really moving.
Mike Spike Drake was the engineer on the album.
There's a Neil Tennant quote about pop music, which I think is very relevant to Regret. And that is that Neil says that the best pop records make you feel good about feeling sad. And I think Regret does that really well. And again, they had a great video. It was the one where they had the idea of being on the beach with all the Baywatch girls. It was one of the best moments, you know, and David Hasselhoff walks through the band as Hookie's doing his bass part. It's a great, great thing. It's just so out of place. New Order on Baywatch.
Miranda Sawyer.
When Regret came out, you know, it didn't get very great reviews. But I think that just happens, isn't it? Speaking as a music journalist, it was just time for New Order to get a slap. And so they brought out this fantastic record, and everyone went, it's all right, I suppose. And then they went to hear it at Reading, and they opened up with that brilliant kind of dun, 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 dun. And I'm so rubbish at singing, but anyway, please superimpose the record.
However upbeat and bouncy the Baywatch video was, life was definitely not a beach for New Order. Tony Wilson decided to close Factory Records under a rising tide of debt. It left a bitter aftertaste. Peter Hook puts the band's point of view.
They were doing things like taking money out of Factory and putting it in the Hacienda and not telling us. But then there was an unfortunate chain of events, though, wasn't there? RLP in Ibiza cost Factory a fortune, and we ended up paying for it ourselves. They were also doing the same thing with Happy Mondays when they sent to Barbados. They made the same mistake twice, which is so Factory. So we weren't exactly blameless.
Tony Wilson.
And remember, the Hacienda was very much, even more than my thing or Alan's thing, it was very much Rob's thing. And Rob, remember, was more New Order than he was Factory. The money would go in, and the money was 50-50. We were 50-50 partners.
The times were a-changing for the Hacienda. Its time as Britain's best club was coming to an end. Drugs, gangsters and the high cost of private security meant that the bad nights now outnumbered the good ones. The club limped on until 1997. By then, its best days were long gone. Dave Haslam and Mike Pickering, two of the club's veteran DJs, witnessed the decline.
When you're a DJ, you're really at the front line of all the stuff that goes down in a club. You're right there when it's at its best, and you're right there when it's at its lowest. And the weird thing about the Hacienda is you could have both in the same night. There was one night when I was DJing, and this girl knocked on the DJ box door, and she just walked in and took off all her clothes and just lay on the floor, started pulling up my trousers. And I'm like DJing, there's 1,500 people in there, and this naked girl is attempting to make love to me. Very good.
Look, there was always a massive drug culture in the Hacienda from day one. Obviously, it's a nightclub. Nightclubs and drugs go together. But when ecstasy came along, it was such a massive media explosion. I saw an article that reckoned that £3 million was the turnover of the drugs in a weekend. Well, when you got that much black money, you got gangsters.
On another occasion, knock on the door, open the door, there's a guy with a gun, and he wanted my records. What do you do? Just lock him out, and it was like instant decision, right, I'm not having any of this. And only kind of afterwards did I realise just what it all meant and how dangerous it all was. There'd be other nights where there'd be a massive fight. There were chairs and tables and beer glasses flying around, and doormen with baseball bats and guys with guns. The dance floor just emptied, and you're like, well, what do we do now? So you turn the music off for a bit, and then all you can hear is breaking glass and girls screaming, so you had to put the music back on.
Here was a club that was in the tourist books. British Airways, High Flyer magazines had it in. You know, it was the place to see in Manchester. We went to the place and said, look, we got people with guns in our clubs, but they didn't want to know.
What happened eventually with the Hacienda was that it had had its day. It had been open just over 15 years. There were other good nights in Manchester. I was still working there on Saturday nights in the final few months, and it was great, and it was full on a Saturday night, but it wasn't much happening in the rest of the week, and the security costs were huge, and the club just lost money.
Paul Morley again.
There's no doubt about it that because of the Hacienda, because of being signed to Factory Records, that they weren't making the kind of money that their sales should have suggested they were being.
It was a nightmare for all of us. At the end of some difficult meeting once, I looked at Bernard and said, Bernard, for heaven's sake, man, I know it's a nightmare, but if there was a button there and you could press it and the Hacienda would never have existed. And Bernard looked me in the eyes very closely and went, show me the button.
As so often is the case, money became the big issue between the band and its label.
Money wasn't regarded as very important in the scheme of things. Really, that was the basis of it. It really wasn't. Wasn't regarded as the most important thing, and it shouldn't be regarded as the most important thing. But it should be regarded as important.
Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook.
Because it affects everyone. It affects the
They
work
nearly-
at the factory and
They nearly
their
brought
ability
us
to
down.
survive,
didn't they?
you know.
They nearly brought us down with them, didn't they?
New Order's drummer, Stephen Morris.
The moral issues or whatever that were the foundations of Factory indirectly sort of led to its downfall, and also our lack of enthusiasm, if that's the word for it, because it was, hey, no contracts with the bands, which in the early days, that's where it's really right on, man, innit? Don't have a contract.
At the end of a tour, we'd get shut up money, you know, here's a big dollop of money for your tour, but really we were missing the bigger picture of money that was coming in from publishing and from records. We had no idea what was coming in, and there was a lot coming in.
It just completely started to fall apart, yeah, 1990. Ironic, because we were at our most successful.
Yeah, but we were at our
in
most
America.
successful because we worked so hard.
A lot, yeah.
So New Order, the most successful indie band of all time, moved to a major label. They joined Pete Tong's London Records, a subsidiary of Warner Brothers. Journalist and critic Miranda Sawyer.
Factory had collapsed. They were in a really terrible situation. London came in like the cavalry, you know. I mean, you can't knock them for moving to London.
How does it feel to treat me like you do? When you laid your hand
One of Rob Gretton's biggest hates was the fact that we had to move to London Records.
Have you seen that documentary that Paul Morley did? It's a fantastic documentary on New Order. And there's a really brilliant bit where he just goes, and they did the unthinkable. They moved to London.
Signing to London Records was just one of the better gags, because not only had they done what they said they would never do, i.e. go to London, they'd gone to London Records, to the heart of the corporate world, and a record company called London.
They haven't sold out, in that old 1970s phrase. They've never sold out. Or actually, when they did sell out, when they sold their back catalogue to London, and it just was aimlessly repackaged, it seemed to be done in such a cynical way that it seemed to have a kind of integrity about it.
I think we hated each other so much, really, at that point, that it just seemed to fit perfectly into the, oh my God, this is awful category.
Here's Bernard Sumner.
One of the sad things is that they didn't consummate the original idea of what it was, and they had every opportunity to be a mega successful label. They had the Mondays, Electronic and New Order, who all sold a lot of records.
But if it wasn't for your misfortune,
Maybe people feel that we've betrayed our stance of independence.
I was mistaken. And I thought I heard you speak.
We didn't betray independence, independence betrayed us.
Republic was the band's first album for London. The label would have to wait a long time for a second. After the 1993 Reading Festival appearance, it would be 5 years before the band made music together again. In the meantime, London repackaged and remixed New Order's back catalogue with ferocious enthusiasm, most notably with True Faith 94 and Blue Monday 95. During this period, Bernard Sumner returned to electronic, and Peter Hook married writer and actress Carolina Hearn. His low-slung bass was a welcome fixture as he fronted the house band on her TV show Mrs. Merton. After his marriage to Caroline ended in 1997, Hookie's band Monaco released the caustic single What Do You Want From Me?
There is one thing that I would die for.
Most people had given up hope of ever seeing New Order together again. Most people, but not Rob Gretton.
Because when you're near me, your love is all I need. Now I can't imagine. What do you want from me?
For 5 years, the members of New Order avoided each other, but eventually the patience and belief of their manager Rob Gretton paid off. He organised a meeting and engineered a détente. Miranda Sawyer gives us an idea of how hard that was.
Rob tried for quite a while to get them back together simply because there was loads of, like a millionaire from Dallas or something offered them millions of pounds to get together just to play at his party, and they wouldn't.
Here's Mike Pickering.
Rob's influence was massive, really. I mean, I'm not sure it would have all happened, to be honest. He was the energy that drove it forward.
The band spent 2 years in the studio Stephen Morris and Gillian Gilbert had built near Macclesfield. The work resulted in one of the greatest comeback tracks ever, the monumental, compelling, shattering song, Crystal.
We're like crystal.
A lot of fans were thrilled to hear it, none more so than longtime supporter Paul Morley.
I adore it, because for me, one of the most irresistible sounds of pop is the combination of that drum, that bass, that guitar and that voice. So as soon as you hear that combination, for my generation, it's the equivalent of Elvis at Las Vegas.
Crystal became the lead track of New Order's hotly anticipated album Get Ready, released in 2001. The track summed up the album's sharper edge.
I don't know what to say.
New Order were a rock band once again. Their new producer, Stephen Osborne, had an impeccable heritage in that area. He'd worked with U2, the Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses. And he'd worked with New Order before on their soundtrack to the film The Beach.
Crystal is kind of the catalyst for the whole album. It was much more of a dance track. When they were writing it in Manchester, it was like a house beat, it was fourth floor. We knew we had a really good song, but it just wasn't sounding anywhere near as exciting as we thought it should do. And Bernard was jamming away and coming up with different ideas, and then he came up with just that riff.
Peter Hook.
Crystal was an electronic song that Bernard had left over. And it was completely dance. Steve recognised that, and when he came to do the music, he wasn't really happy with the dance vibe of it. He was looking for a different direction, and he found it.
And also Hooky wants to do more of what he does as well. So they want to make a more aggressive album, but keeping the dance aspect of the front as well, which is kind of what I love doing anyway.
It's not easy.
And once he got that, he seemed to think, that's how it should be. And I think that was the signpost. We found the first signpost then. It said, get ready on it this way. That was it.
And another thing about this record was that we got Steve playing a drum kit again, rather than using just solely electronic drums. I think he got really excited about that, and it immediately brought a new sound back that they hadn't been using.
I don't know what to say. You don't care anyway. I'm a man in a cage without good. I've been trained. Here comes love. It's like honey. You can't buy it with money. You're not alone anymore. You shut me to the core. You shut me to the core.
New Order had evolved once again. The album featured guest appearances by Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins and Bobby Gillespie and Andrew Innes from Primal Scream. Critic Miranda Sawyer has a simple explanation for the band's typically unself-conscious change of direction.
Bernard doesn't particularly go to nightclubs anymore, or none of them do. I mean, they do a bit. They're not part of that culture anymore. So it's a bit more difficult for them to make dance records. So therefore, they're making rock records because that's what they're interested in. And they still have opinions and they understand it.
The instigator of Get Ready, Rob Gretton, New Order's stalwart manager, never heard the album. He died of a heart attack in May 1999, the year that his beloved Manchester City returned to the Premiership. Rob was 46. He had many friends. Mike Pickering is one of them.
It was a big shock. He died overnight in his sleep. I think that it kind of bonded the group and made them stronger. I remember Bernard said to me, we should all stay in contact a lot more. And I think that was a good thing. I think that what it did was it meant that they all realised that when you have a history with people, you don't just walk away from it, really.
It was funny because Rob's one of those people that even though he's gone, will never be really gone. You don't actually think of him as gone.
Kevin Cummins.
Rob not being there was a bigger shock than Ian Curtis not being there, because Rob had been through everything with them and Ian had only been around for 2 years, whereas Rob had been there for 25 years.
It's not that you don't miss him. With Rob, you carry his opinion and what he did for the band and what he formed quite unself-consciously. It's part of New Order and it always will be, really.
For the second time in their career, New Order had to come to terms with a tragic loss before they could carry on. They dedicated Get Ready to Rob Gretton.
Open hearts, empty spaces, dusty roads to distant places.
A turn-of-the-century feeling was palpable. The loss of Rob Gretton, an echo of the grief at the band's beginning.
I think of you.
And there were other reminders of the past for New Order. They visited the set of 24-Hour Party People, a film based on Factory Records and its personnel. And in 2002, New Order released Retro, a lavish 4-CD review of their long career.
Jesus comes to take your hand. I won't let go.
They've looked back, but are now intent on the future. They enjoyed making the last album Get Ready and being back together in the studio. Steve Osborne saw it happening.
Everyone was just getting into it and enjoying it, and that was very much as it was. The whole record was very positive.
It was quite joyous. I mean, the greatest thing about it was by having Steve Osborne there to take all the flack, it meant you could actually quite enjoy it. It's a great record, and it sounds like a band record, and it sounds like a band that have found themselves again. So really, I think the nucleus was formed for us to carry on.
My instinct was, my God, I don't know how they get away with it. There's no other group that are now 25 years old that could come back with a sound that is exactly like their sound with a few technical updates and it be hailed as a masterpiece and in everybody's top 10 lists.
You're the kind of person that I always wanted to be with.
I've enjoyed it more on this album than I did on the last one because we were still looking for how to do it, and I have really enjoyed it this time. It makes me feel like I'm home.
Most recently, New Order contributed a song to the War Child Project to raise money for the children of Iraq. Again, their choice was inspired, showing once more that they're in touch with the feeling in the air. They covered Jimmy Cliff's anti-war song, Vietnam. All of which brings us up to date with our story of the northwest of England's second most influential band.
Jesus comes to take your hand. I won't let go. I won't let go.
Tony Wilson sums up New Order's unique achievement.
Great groups of one revolution, they are dinosaurs come the next revolution, with the exception of Joy Division New Order. It is their profound achievement to have still been alive and aware and awake for the next time round.
I'm Mark Radcliffe, and thanks for listening. Let's leave Paul Morley with the last word, for now, on New Order's future.
Whether they can ever make an album that somehow hits what has become known as a zeitgeist moment again. Who can tell? It might be the zeitgeist moment in 10 years' time is a bunch of people in their late 50s who were into punk and rave. But because the zeitgeist is always so directed towards being young, then the very nature of the beast suggests they can't do it. But then I wouldn't put it past them. They may be the ones that create the new template. And there's got to be a new template because people into music are now 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. There's got to be a kind of new template for those people. And I wouldn't put it past New Order being the ones to come up with it.
I'm gonna live till I die. I'm gonna live to get high.
88 to 91.